Senator Allen, thank you, Senator Gaines. Senator Allen. And then we have Senator Pavley and Senator Huff.
We spoke briefly about the article in the LA Times that talks about all of these claims that have been filed by Tudor Perini, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about it. I mean, they're claiming in the Times that these sort of change orders could cost 10% to more than 30% above original estimates for the segment between Madera and Fresno. And want to get, you said that there's a different story to be told, and I'd love to get your perspective on that. I know you spoke about it briefly with Senator Roth, but I want to get a little deeper into it.
Yeah, let me just say, first of all, in the article, I was quoted as saying that this is not a self-executing process. And actually, I think there was a probably more accurate article on this process written in the Fresno Bee, which we can provide to you. We made it clear to this reporter that the fact that somebody wants to claim something does not mean that we accept that claim. Mr. Morales can go into some details on this, but everything in that article was basically based on things that we ourselves had been saying. We publish all this information, we talk about the risks, and we talk about something that we're constantly managing the risks of the project. And so as we do that, we'll say, well, if X, Y, and Z happens, then that will lead to higher costs that will eat into our contingency. That doesn't mean those things have happened. It means that if we don't manage them, they might happen. And so we're managing to those risks. So first of all, to try to conflate risk numbers that we put out there with actual costs is just, it's misleading, and it doesn't serve you well.
When you call them risk numbers, what does that mean exactly?
Well, what it means is that, as I said to Senator Roth, we're constantly looking at what is the contingency that we have for the construction budget and what are the threats to eat up that contingency. So, for example, if we say, if we don't increase the pace of delivery of right-of-way parcels, it could lead to contractor claims of X amount.
Right.
That doesn't mean those contractor claims of X amount become realities. It means that we have a management challenge to manage the right-of-way process. So the point is, it gives information to us and to you as to what are the things we have to focus our management attention on. So we start off by saying, if we don't get our arms around certain things, it could translate into cost, but it doesn't mean that it has done that.
Why do we build
warning system?
Why do we build all these costs into the contracts? I mean, this is, I'm sure, betraying my total ignorance about the contracting process. But why do we build in all these kind of penalties for us to, if we're not able to quickly take care of all the right-of-way challenges that we know are going to constantly be popping up?
Well, some of them we didn't know were going to pop up, and some of it I've said we got off the ground kind of slow on the right-of-way in the first contract. In the second and third contracts, we're actually on track, doing very well. So it's pretty standard in a contract that the contractor has to go out and get in equipment and so forth to be ready to work, and if you can't deliver that parcel, the contractor has the right to say these are costs that I had to incur. So it's not something that we gave them. This is pretty standard. And then there are other costs that we, frankly, the third-party contract costs for the utilities and the rail, that's plagued a number of projects through Southern California and other places because they're hard to estimate. But we're still running within our contingency. Mr. Morales deals with this day to day, so I should ask him to just supplement.
Just to put the change orders in context a little bit, the bidders submit their proposals based on a set of assumptions that we provide to them, and so things are always going to change to some degree, and those changes, and this is not unique. Any of my colleagues here at the other agencies could tell you the same experiences. Change orders, I think, become a four-letter word almost, but a change order, if you're remodeling your house, could be as simple as moving a light switch from here to there. I mean, we deal with those types of things. We also can deal with things, differing site conditions. If no one knew that something was underground or the ground composition was different than what was anticipated, that can become a change order. To date, we've had a total of about $18 million of change orders paid, all of them within the scope and the dollars within the contingency, meaning we had identified these as risks that we knew, and we had set aside budget for these. Altogether, for the Phase 1 program, we have almost $11 billion of contingency built into the estimate. And so specifically to deal with the things that we cannot and the contractors cannot foresee at the start of work. So,
And that's part of the original estimate?
and that is part of the, so when you see the $64 billion estimate, $11 billion of that is contingency.
So I'd love to understand how you set that number, and then also your reserve numbers. I was looking in the booklet that the reserve is something like $167 million, which is for this piece. Okay, which still seems like a pretty small percentage of the total.
Well, so we have adopted a pretty state-of-the-art process for setting contingency, and it's to take a risk-based approach. If you look at standard process at many agencies, and it's true of other state projects, there's simply a flat percentage that's attached, a 5 or 10% contingency attached to a contract, and that then becomes the amount you can manage to address unforeseen issues. We actually go in and do a very detailed analysis of what the specific risks might be and then quantify those and develop then an estimate based on that. And so for our first few contracts, when you then back it up to a percentage, it's not derived as a percentage, but they've ended up between roughly 14 and 16% of budget being carried in contingency for the first three contracts. But it's based on an assessment of specific risks to each of those contracts, and we work then. Part of the value of that is not just identifying then what those risks are, but then managing them. And so if we know, for instance, right-of-way is an issue that could potentially subject us to claims, that's then where we put significant management effort to make sure that we avoid those issues. And so we identify the risk, and then we work as hard as we can to manage it to avoid paying it, but we've set a contingency level to cover that amount of exposure.
And we should clarify that 167 is against what, about a $900 million, $940 million.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, I didn't understand that. Okay, so I guess my final question is a big picture question, and being curious to hear anyone's answer to this. But you know, this is the kind of favorite punching bag out there in the public these days. How would you respond to a constituent, question at an event, who's been reading all this bad press, who perhaps voted for the bond measure years back and liked the idea, but feels as though this is kind of turned into a big morass? I mean, how do we, particularly people in Southern California now who see this now focused on Northern California, at least in the shorter medium term. I mean, how would you talk to someone who's grown increasingly skeptical in the public about the chances of this being built? We've got the lieutenant governor talking down the project, who may very well be governor next. How do we talk to our constituents about this?
Well, I get asked this question a lot, as you would imagine, and I would say three things. The first thing is that I ask people to step back and remember that this isn't a static situation. This is not a situation where it's a choice between building high-speed rail or doing nothing. That we do have a state that's growing, that we are going to have 50 million people, that we are going to have to make infrastructure investments that are also going to be sustainable in terms of our ability to do this, and that when you look at the cost of doing other things to maintain equivalent levels of mobility, they are 2 to 3 times higher than what we're talking about here. It's 4,300 lane miles of freeways, it's new airport complexes, runway complexes, 116 gates, et cetera. So I first ask people to step back and realize that this is about what kind of investments we're making in the future, not whether we make those investments. We have to make some investments in the future. The second thing I tell people is that this is really hard, and that everything we've done in California has been hard. The state water project, which has been a tremendous boon to our state, passed this legislature by 1 vote. When it did, Governor Pat Brown said, now we're truly one California. The BART system I worked on passed by 1 vote. The master plan for higher education passed by one vote. We passed by one vote. We join a long list of initiatives in this state that were controversial and difficult for people to imagine in advance how important they would be. And I ask people to realize that this is really hard, and we can do it. And what we're saying in this draft business plan is we're now seeing how we can get the first very important step done, and we can do this. And so to a certain extent, it is a matter of faith. But when we look back at these things that we've done in California, nobody wishes that we hadn't done them.
Thank you for those answers. Where do you, this data about the the airport costs, can you break that down a little bit more? Because that's something that I haven't heard as much. And one of the things that people often say is that, there's plenty of decent airline infrastructure. My problem's not being able to get from LA Airport to San Francisco in 2 hours. My problem's getting from LA Airport to Dodger Stadium in 2 hours. I'd love to get a better sense about your vision of the future challenges of the airline industry as it relates to north-south travel.
In the interest of time, maybe I can provide some of this information to you offhand, but let me just say we've got one of the most congested corridors in the country here between LA and San Francisco. 40% of the flights are delayed. And maybe the quickest thing I can say to you is one of the biggest advocates for high-speed rail in California is the director of the San Francisco airport. Because like Europe, they want to see a mode shift to trains for shorter intercity travel and use their limited airport gates for transoceanic and transcontinental travel. And we see that at other airports around as well. That has been the experience in the Northeast corridor with Amtrak over the years taking now 80% of what it has been that air corridor. You can't get a train from Paris to Belgium to Brussels. You can't get a plane. You take a train. So they want to see this shift, and we think ultimately that's where a lot of the benefit will be. But in the interest of time, I'd be happy to supplement that with some specific information for your office.
I appreciate that.